Hello guys, welcome to Code. And today you're with me, Kulio Kininda, software engineer with a little over 7 years experience. And today I'll be taking you through the Ultimate Spring Developer Series from beginner all the way to advanced on how you can develop enterprise grade, world class Spring web applications. So without wasting any of your time, let's get cracking. The agenda for this series includes Spring Framework, Spring Core, Spring Boot, Spring Cloud, Spring MVC, Spring Data JPA, Spring Security, as well as Spring Integration. By the end of the series, you will understand how to use all of these modules to create an enterprise-grade web-based application, and you'll be able to deploy that into an environment such as your AWS EC2. So let's get to it. For the prerequisites in this particular series, you're looking at Java fundamentals, object-oriented programming principles, your inheritance, your polymorphism, abstraction, and things like that, and also basic web application understanding on how web applications behave, or if you've used like a HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and things like that. Basic database understanding. This will be querying a database, creating a table, adding columns, inserting data into the database, retrieving data from a select, and finally some version control understanding like your Git or similar version control. Now that we have created our Hello World microservice with a GET REST API, we're going to dive deep into the Spring Web module and understand what is a RESTful API or what are RESTful web APIs. So firstly, we're going to jump to our browser, and in our Spring initializer, we still have the same configuration, so it's the same project. If you didn't see the Hello World tutorial, please do jump into that episode and then come back here, and we can proceed with this particular build up from that particular service. So we still have the same dependencies: Lombok, Spring Dev Tools, Spring Web, which is what we'll be talking about in this particular episode. So we'll be discussing RESTful APIs, and we will see what that is. So let's start by asking our browser here, what is REST API? And the reason for this, I want us to go to a specific website, which is restfulapi.net. And over here, you will get a nice summary of what a REST API is and what are RESTful APIs. Essentially, REST is an acronym for Representational State Transfer, which is an architectural style and a principle or a set of standards that an API needs to conform to be regarded as a RESTful. So that is very important. Part of those principles or part of that standard is REST APIs need to communicate via HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and that particular protocol has a set of methods of communication, being a get, post, put, delete, which are widely used methods within the HTTP or HTTP protocol. So that then aligns with the standards for an API to be RESTful if it conforms to that particular protocol. And also these principles, and we can see some of them here, it has a uniform interface, it implements cacheable, so you can implement a cache for lookup data, reference data, and things like that. We have a client-server communication where a client can request data, and the mode or the format of data payload can be JSON standard, which a request and a response can be of a JSON format, and that can be understood by the client and the server. And then there's layered systems, so you can have integrations in between or a number of systems that are part of the transaction or the process. And then we have stateless. Stateless meaning a client can request a particular process to be triggered by the server or request data from the server, and the client's request needs to have all the details necessary for the server to process that particular request. If that is not the case, then the server cannot process that particular request. So stateless means the state of a session is not kept by either side, and it is not kept by the implementation itself. So the request and the response has no state at all. It all has to do with a request coming through and that request being fulfilled, and that's about it. And code on demand, that's optional. So there is so if we look at these particular principles, we can then regard our API as a RESTful API. But you can go into deep detail on this website, and you will find all the details that you will need. That just sums it up for us to understand what is a RESTful API. Now that we know what a RESTful API is and how what principles guide a RESTful API, let's go back to our application and implement those or develop those APIs. So we already have a get here. So I will add some docs. Let me just do that. So I'll add some documentation here. And over here, I will say retrieve data resource. Let's just call it that. And then I'm going to add a few other HTTP methods here. And I will say create a data resource. And we will have a post. So we'll annotate with post, just like so. And we will create our public. We'll have a response entity here. Our response entity will just make it of a generic type. And then we will call this create. Now in my create, before I add the logic in this particular method, in my create, I need to create something. So for me to create that particular resource, I need a payload structure that will then be created when I send my request. So if we just come over here and create a package, let's go there, new package, we'll call this model. We'll use an example of a student. So we'll create a Java class. So just make it a Pojo, call it student DTO, enter. And in here, I need to add a couple of fields. So I'll have my private string. Let's have it as ID, and then we'll have private string first name. Let's do first name just like that. Private string last name, yes, and then private string email is from contact. Private string, let's do mobile, just like that. So now we have all the fields that we want. We'll add some access modifiers and some instantiators for our Pojo. And how we're going to do that, we'll use Lombok annotations. So we'll have a data, which will scaffold some getters and setters for us. And you can basically go into the sources of this particular annotation. And I can basically download some sources here. And then to build up all the documentation, and I can continue reading what that will essentially do. But for now, that should be fine. This should be the access modifiers. Then I will have a builder because I want to be able to build a project. Oh, my docs came through. So you see now all the docs are here. See also getter, setter, args to string equals and hash. So all of these are made available via this data. So it just adds the access modifiers. And then we'll add a builder over here. Let's continue like that. Then I'll do all arguments constructor and no arguments constructor so that my builder is happy. And then I will also add some JSON properties. So I'll include null and ignore unknown. I'm also going to serialize this particular object. So we'll implement some serializable just like that. Right. So now we have our let's say, blueprint of the student, what the data would look like or what the payload would look like. Now we need to plug this data into our create API. So what we're going to do here is going to pass in a, so let me just do that. And then in the method arguments, we'll pass an annotation of request body. The request body is the payload that we want to pass through, and we will call this student DTO, and this will be payload. Just like that, we have our student payload. Right, and then because we don't have any logic, so what we'll do here, I want to print out something like, okay, I don't have a logger attached, so I'm gonna have a annotation here, self for J, to add a logger, and now my logger is available. I'll just print out some info, and what I want to print out here is create a resource with email, or let me just say create a student actually. Let's say student with email. It is actually not recommended to print out the payload as is. So if you have a field that you want to print out from the payload, you can print out any of the fields, but it is actually never recommended practice to print out the entire payload that you receive. So we are using the email, so that should be fine with us. Create a student with email, just like that, and then what you will return over here is a response entity, just like that. And actually, instead of the OK, I want to do a status created body payload, just like that. And you see that over here, I'm going to get the created with the body of the payload. So I will return the payload as is because there's no other business logic. We'll just see how the payload looks like in the API response. So now that we have a post which will create a resource for us, what we then need to do is do the other two implementations. So let's do that quickly. Let's do update a resource, and we will do put, and we will do that, and then we will log update with email, and then return just like that. So now we have our put of updating a resource, and you see we have our payload, and remember our DTO does have an ID, and in our update we do not pass an ID yet, so let's fix that quickly. So we'll do let's pass in an ID over there. Then we will say we actually also expect a path variable which is long ID. Now this ID will then be populated there. Instead of updating student with email, now we can say update student with ID. And then we will pass in the ID that was requested for an update, just like that. And we are good to go. And we will get a 200 OK with our payload that we passed in. Right, then finally, let's do a delete. And then let's see how that looks like. So delete a resource. So here we'll just do private response entity, just like that. And we will pass in a, oh, I forgot the delete. Yep, and then add the ID over here, just like that. Now we have our ID. We will log this, and my auto complete is working nicely. And then I will return a 200 OK with no body over there. And now our delete is complete. We now have our REST APIs. And remember, we did say that the commonly used format is JSON. So just to show you how that looks like in implementation, what we can do here is add some restrictions and say consumes media type, and that will be of type JSON, application JSON value. And you can see it recommends the producer as well. So it will consume application JSON and produce application JSON, and that should basically suffice for what we want. We can do the same for all the other ones, but just to show you, we will test it over here. So let's save this. Now we have our APIs. Let's run our application and test it in Postman. So I'm going to start up this application. I'm going to stop that. Right, now it's building up. Let me see my Postman. Right, in Postman, I need to create a new collection, blank collection. I'm going to call this Ultimate. Come on. I'm going to call this Ultimate Spring Series, just like that. Enter. And in my Ultimate Spring Series, I want to add a few API calls, so I'm going to add that. And this will be called create, and the method HTTP method type is post. We're going to do 8080 because our application defaults to 8080. And you will see that over here on startup, Tomcat started on port 8080. That is fine. And then moving back to our Postman, we are going to pass in a request body that will be of raw type, and it is JSON format. Right, and then we will add our payload conforming to our student DTO. But what we'll pass in here is the first name. Let's use John, and our last name, and John Doe, that's good. And then we'll do email, subscribe at zip code, that should be fine. And finally, we'll do mobile. That mobile should be fine as well. Right, so we have first name, last name, email, and mobile. That should suffice, and we can send this through and test it out. Send this. Right, and we have our payload available there, and we also have a 201 created. So I can essentially copy this. And what I want to do is, before I do the update, I just want to change this to a different format. Let's say text, for example. And if I try to send this, you will see that there will be an HTTP media type not supported exception. So that's because our media type was very specific of what we want to consume, which is of JSON type, and hence that's why. And also, if you want to see that and you're interested in more deeper details, go to headers. These are also generated headers, and you can see here the text content type is plain, right? And now let's go back to our body. Let's change this to JSON. Let's check the headers. And you can see our content type is application JSON, which then aligns or conforms to the consume application JSON of application /JSON. That is the correct expected format. Right, now if I send this again, we will get a 201 created. And remember, there is no business logic sitting in this implementation. So every request we pass in, that as long as it conforms to this, it will give us a 201 created. But if we had like a database, we would then ensure that the validations actually kick in to make sure we have only a single unique record created, and we block any duplication from that. But that being said, let's continue and see the update. Now we're gonna let's add another API call. Let's do add, and we will do our update. Let's call this update. Then this will be a put, and our update will be our localhost / let's say we use any of the IDs, 2025, let's say maybe 2025 is an ID. We go to the body, and you see we have the body here, and we can just change it to the correct format. And in the name, let's say we change this to Joe, and subscribe, let's say update. And the number, let's maybe end it with like a 200. Right, so now we've updated something on the payload. Of course, there's no database on the other end. We'll just see this come through on the response. So we send this through, and you see request method not supported, method post, and we want to actually use a put, and that's what we want to send through. Let's send this, and we get a 200 OK, which means our payload was updated. And you can see on the response, that's what we sent, and that's what we got back. That's good enough. And similarly, if we do another request for a delete, let's add another one, and we'll call this one a delete, just like that. And also here, we'll go for a delete. And similarly, you will see here on the delete, we expect an ID, path variable of ID, and we will just do 2025, just like that. Body, there is no body that we expect. So you see here, there's no request body, and we can then, why is it going back to post? Because this should be a delete, right? And then we can send this through, and we get a 200 OK. And if we go to our application, remember we are doing logs as we call the different methods. So if you look at the logs, you will see that all of the API calls that we're doing are basically being logged out. So we created with that, email address. We also did another create, and then we also did an update. We also did a delete. And you will see that we also had these method not supported that we were testing just to show you some validation rules on the API calls. So now with all of this being said, this is essentially how to conform your APIs to be RESTful and implementing them in Spring Web. And the next episode, we will be talking Spring Data JPA as to how we can then implement this with a real database and see the end-to-end with some business logic. For now, cheers.